Hello there, my name is Ian and welcome to my YouTube channel. I'm excited today to finally discuss one of my favorite cult stature progressive rock bands, the legendary Graaf Generator. In the process of researching this video, Jim Christopoulos and Phil Smart's Graaf Generator, the book, has provided invaluable research and is available as an affordable Kindle version from Amazon. Additionally, much of the information was sourced from the Graaf Generator Charisma Years boxed set, which, in my opinion, is one of the best sets on the market in terms of value for money and content. Formed in 1967 in Manchester, England, Graaf Generator, or Graaf, or simply VdGG, are a fascinating and utterly unique band. The classic lineup was formed by four close-knit musicians and friends: Peter Hamill, vocals, piano, guitar, and songs; David Jackson, electronically treated saxes and flute; Hugh Banton, organ; and Guy Evans, drums. Led by Peter Hamill's dramatic, operatic vocals and psychologically horror-tinged yet personalized lyrics, Graaf Generator combined bombastic symphonic prog with an edge of an electronic avant-garde experimentation. In contrast to the conventional band setup at the time, VdGG eschewed electric guitar for much of their classic years, preferring to rest on the shoulders of the dual piano-organ format. Saxophonist David Jackson filled the role typically occupied by a lead and/or rhythm guitar player, as he was armed with a host of electronics, microphones, and pedals, including wah-wah and distortion, to fill out the band's sound, as well as the chordal palette. One of his pedals could even recreate the sound of a full-blown saxophone ensemble, which, like Roland Kirk, was made even more frightfully real by Jackson's playing 2 or 3 saxophones at once. The innovation of the band wasn't left simply to David Jackson. In Hugh Banton, we have a genius electrical engineer. If an organ he wanted didn't exist, he simply built it. And in fact, many Graaf Generator recording sessions were held up by Hugh Banton tinkering with his organs. Of course, Nick Potter served the role on a few of the earliest Graaf Generator records, not to mention his return for 1978's vastly underrated Quiet Zone/Pleasure Dome and the ferocious Vital live album. However, by this point, Nick was out of the band, forcing them to creatively add organ pedals into Banton's arsenal. This could be seen by some as a detriment, but I found that the use of the organ pedals adds to the band's sense of fluidity on stage. Drummer Guy Evans could in fact be a bit of a pounder. What amazes me is just how expressive he can be, while also bringing something of a free jazz aesthetic to the proceedings. In a band filled with innovation and expression, of course, vocalist Peter Hamill would feel the need to attack his voice. At times, he reminds me of Captain Beefheart, though the timbre couldn't be more different. In fact, with the dual keyboard sound, they remind me of a guitarless Procol Harum, or even the Doors with their poet laureate Jim Morrison being a decent comparison here. However, it's the theatrical, histrionic vocals of Arthur Brown that are perhaps the most direct point of reference, with Hamill himself acknowledging that early influence. In 1971, Graaf Generator released their 4th album, Pawn Hearts, a breathtakingly odd, dramatic, and unhinged classic. At the time, they had just finished a grueling German tour from hell, including 21 cities over 23 days, all while living in abject poverty, traveling in a broken-down ice cream van and staying in bad hotels, barely able to rub enough coin together to buy a sandwich or even call home. The whole ordeal, of course, was commemorated as the opening track of Peter Hamill's 2nd solo album, in the song German Overalls from Chameleon and the Shadow of the Night. Their label, Charisma Records, had been founded solely on promoting Graaf Generator, but were more interested in the crowd-pleasing bands that brought in money, like Genesis and Incredible String Band. Yet, manager Tony Stratton Smith still believed that VdGG were creating great art. They still had to deal with less than ideal PA systems and mounting debt, and were known for their mad and inspiring yet wholly inconsistent live performances. According to VdGG the book, their performances could range from being emotionally cathartic and joyous to absolute shrieks of noise and feedback. That being said, Pawn Hearts represents a high creative time in the band's history. The harsh touring conditions established a sense of camaraderie among the band and inspired Hamill to write several new songs while on tour, including the backbone of A Plague of Lighthouse Keepers in the back of that ice cream truck. While on this tour, the band also debuted two new pieces, the proto-metal Assault of Lemmings and the schizophrenic ballad Man-Erg, the latter a profound meditation on the nature of duality and free will that also musically encapsulated the extremities of good and evil. At this time, Hamill's voice was also developing far beyond the smooth choir boy falsetto sound of the early years and into something much more abrasive. In his words, he was selectively destroying his voice beyond the limits of endurance. After the spring tour had concluded, in June and July of 1971, the band moved into manager Tony Stratton Smith's Luxford house in Crowborough, where they ironed out the remainder of the album's arrangements and prepared to record with producer John Anthony. A psychedelic experience, according to saxophonist Dave Jackson. The band encamped in the allegedly haunted house and occasionally engaged in one or two illegal substances, which helped inspire their collective creativity. Hugh's record player was connected to an oscilloscope, which visually represented the music of Bach, Stravinsky, and Messiaen, and others by way of visualizing the waveforms. Cannabis was an even larger factor, apparently, and evidently the band's drug of choice, with vocalist Peter Hamill's creativity apparently extending beyond being the primary songwriter and vocalist to also being the primary roller of the joints. Following those rehearsals and times of psychedelic experimentation, Pawn Hearts was eventually recorded from July through September of 1971 at Trident Studios. John Anthony produced, with engineers Robin Cable, David Henschel, and Ken Scott, while Side 1 comprised of Lemmings and Man-Erg, which were well rehearsed and stage tested at this point. The album still had plenty of room for studio experimentation and magic. This included the psychedelic Razor, a product of home recording where Hugh combined experiments, recording an electric razor forward and backward simultaneously with some experimental guitar fret recordings that Peter had made. This can be heard on the transition into Cog, an early subsection of Lemmings, a song that encourages the youth of the day to look to a more positive future as opposed to blindly following the masses to destruction and extinction. However, it was the Side 2 side-length suite, A Plague of Lighthouse Keepers, that inspired the most collaboration among the members of Graaf Generator. Hamill had composed the backbone of the composition while on tour, but had left it open to the others to design the transitions and fill out arrangements. Hugh Banton contributed the ethereal pictures/lighthouse. Guy, the multi-layered interlude Cosmos Tours, which involved stacking multiple takes of the band on top of each other, resulting in utter chaos. And finally, David Jackson contributed the finale, We Go Now, with lyrics by Hamill, of course. The composition, A Plague of Lighthouse Keepers, was recorded in small 3 to 5 minute bursts of music at the time, and later edited by Hugh and producer John Anthony, while Hamill, Guy, and David went off to play a Hamill solo gig. The result was an uncompromising, dense, and daring masterwork that upon hearing the final edit, Peter Hamill proclaimed, "That was really amazing. At that point, I could die." Uncompromising as it may be, the original concept for Pawn Hearts would have been even more so. Originally intended as a double record set in the vein of Pink Floyd's Ummagumma, the original plan was to have LP1, the Pawn Hearts we all know and hopefully love. LP2 would have been split two ways. Side 3 would have been a collection of band solo compositions, while the final side would have captured the band performing earlier material, such as Killer, Darkness, and Squid Octopus, live in the studio in their road-tested arrangements. Of these recordings, a few survive to this very day and are available as part of the Graaf Generator Charisma Years box set, which, along with the book, provided invaluable research to this video. The solo tunes that survived are as follows: Angle of Incidence by Guy Evans, a drum-based electronic experimental musique concrete composition involving miking the stairs at Trident and throwing neon light tubes down the steps, combined with a variety of delay and effects units. Hugh Banton's was Diminutions, a further development of multi-tracked organ overdubs in the vein of his Pictures/Lighthouse section in A Plague of Lighthouse Keepers. Finally, David Jackson's was the short but jazzy and more accessible Punkers theme. A fourth tune, the multi-movement Archimedes Agnostic, penned by David Jackson with Greek lyrics by Hamill, was recorded but never developed beyond the demo stage. The live side, unfortunately, only has one surviving recording, Squid Octopus, a deranged, banshee scream of a number that I still have yet to completely wrap my brain around. It's intense and bonkers mad, but also contains many memorable moments. It's a pity that Killer and Darkness were recorded but didn't survive, but what we do have are BBC radio session versions of these that are from the era, and those offer a peek into what the live and the studio versions might have been. In the process of preparing for this video, reading the book and listening intently to the Charisma Years box set, I have assembled my own double LP track listing of Pawn Hearts, based on available material and information about the sessions. The organization would work something like this. Side 1 would be the normal album, though I'm stretching the definition by describing Pawn Hearts this way. As in, these are songs they played on stage, and then they took them into the studio and simply recorded them. Side 2 would be a group-crafted studio number. Side 3 would consist of solo-crafted studio numbers. And finally, Side 4 would be the live in the studio, raw and unhinged, yet familiar group effort. So, as follows, Side 1 would be Lemmings, Man Erg. Side 2, A Plague of Lighthouse Keepers. Side 3, Angle of Incidence, Diminutions, Punkers Theme, and W. I'll get to that in a moment. Side 4 would be, of course, Squid/Octopus. Now, if you are listening to this digitally, I would recommend adding these as bonus tracks. Killer from the BBC sessions, as well as Darkness from the BBC sessions. These will not fit on a single CDR, as the track listing as it stands is sitting around 77 minutes. But if you don't mind making it 2 discs, you might want to add those bonuses to your own version, or just simply make a playlist on iTunes or something like that. Essentially, between A Plague of Lighthouse Keepers and the solo side, you'd have an entire LP's worth of Graaf Generator experimenting with the studio, both as solo artists as well as an ensemble. Then, Side D would have completely let loose in terms of performance. It would have been a fascinating experience, I think, to start from the relatively conventional way of making an album and slowly unraveling to an unhinged performance, especially given just how uncompromising and out there this album is right from the start. So, on to W. W is a very nice song with a spooky ethereal melody that also induces a soft jump scare by the end. I really dig it. It has Peter Hamill solo album vibes to me, and it really wouldn't have been that far out of place on Chameleon in the Shadow of the Night, I feel. Unsurprisingly, W was written in 1967 while Hamill was still in school. So it actually does make a nice lead-in to the fourth side, which was meant to be live in the studio remakes of older songs. Admittedly, placing W in my side 3 track list is the biggest departure from Graaf Generator's original intent. It was devised to augment the Theme 1 single, but in lieu of Jackson/Hamill's Archimedes Agnostic, it's a nice segue out of Diminutions, and it's a nice coda for the solo side. It feels like a nice contrast to the rest of the guy's solo contributions, and there's even more nice ethereal stuff in the center of the track to hook it back to Diminutions. Yes, I think this sequence works not half bad. What's perhaps the most interesting thing to me is that the solo track side deconstructs A Plague of Lighthouse Keepers to its basic ingredients. Hugh, Dave, and Guy wrote much of the interconnecting tunes for A Plague of Lighthouse Keepers, while Hamill wrote the structure of the epic. It makes sense, then, that Hugh's ambient section, Pictures/Lighthouse, reminds me so much of Diminutions. Guy's section, Cosmos Tours, with the multiple Graaf generators playing on top of each other, is also hugely reminiscent of his Angle of Incidence, avant-garde layered drum piece. The outlier, of course, is We Go Now, which isn't really related that much to Ponker's theme, with the exception that the Stephen W. Taylor remix of Pawn Hearts, Guy plays a jazzy beat under the final section that is somewhat similar to Ponker's in style, but more on this later. The one composition that I completely left off my proposed Pawn Hearts double LP was Theme 1, composed by Beatles producer George Martin. Theme 1 was the BBC radio broadcast theme music, and the band were very fond of staying up until 5 in the morning to hear it because they loved it so much. It was initially debuted as a live encore number during the H2HE Who Am the Only One era tours, as the band were fond of playing these short and absurd covers as encores, ranging from the BBC Radio 1 theme to the theme from Star Trek. It was eventually recorded and released as a single, of course backed with W, and led to some great success for the band in Italy, but it was never intended to be a part of Pawn Hearts. While Graaf Generator's Theme 1 represents a great performance of a great song, Peter Hamill is not at all present on this track, which I think alienated him a bit at the time and may have led to him going solo for a little while. It was also placed without the band's consent on the original US versions of Pawn Hearts, jarringly between Lemmings and Manorg, which completely destroys the natural flow of the material. So, while I compromised and included W in lieu of Archimedes Agnostic, this was a creative decision on my part that I think works quite well for the flow and what was originally intended, while Theme 1 simply has no place whatsoever as a part of the Pawn Hearts tracklist and should be approached as a novelty single. Pawn Hearts, as it stands, is one of my favorite insane prog albums of the 1970s. It's daring, yet somehow absurdly funny, chaotic, yet melodic. It's a dark, hammer horror psychological nightmare full of twisted lyrics and music ranging from the chaotic to the serene within the same composition. From the opening strums of Peter Hamill's acoustic guitar on Lemmings through to the final moments of the anthemic A Plague of Lighthouse Keepers, Pawn Hearts offers a complete reality distortion, a dark, psychedelic experience that leaves the listener disoriented, yet with a sense that something unforgettable and soul-enriching has transpired. Opening track Lemmings is one of my very favorite Graaf Generator compositions, with its lyrics about avoiding the mass production consumer culture pitfalls, augmented with schizophrenic musical turns. Manorg is a song that used to absolutely terrify me. Getting inside the mind of a deranged killer and humanizing that person is something that my teenage mind was both drawn to and equally repulsed by. Its form is essentially a ballad, but then it erupts into the pulsating sax and organ section that throws the entire thing sideways. It's just beautiful, dramatic, and inventive stuff. A Plague of Lighthouse Keepers is the album's zenith. It's one of those prog epics that when it starts, I'm just ready to take the journey of extremes. What impresses me the most is just how melodic it can be amidst the dramatic swings of mood and lyrics about ghosts and specters. It really pushes the concept of the prog suite to areas no other band dared to explore, aside from maybe Procol Harum's bonkers trip in Held 'Twas an I, which has a similar psychotic range of programmatic music balanced by semi-accessible tunes. All in all, a very difficult album to talk about in any objective form, and a huge influence on the way I view music ever since I heard it back in my junior year of high school. I do think ultimately the band and the record label made the right choice in releasing it as a single album, 3 tracks only. As Guy Evans stated, the final live in the studio side looked too much to the past of the band, while sides 1 and 2 and the studio side were much more forward-thinking. And as much as I enjoy the studio solo pieces and find it fascinating how they relate to A Plague of Lighthouse Keepers, I can see it all being a bit intimidating for people, especially in 1971. And when it comes to this kind of experimental and avant-garde music, less is often more. Ultimately, it's best to look back on this material now with the hindsight of history as a fan of the band and speculate what could have been. But it's the 3 tracks that comprise the original running order that brought us here in the first place. So now that I've talked about the background and the recording of the album and shared some of my feelings on the work as a whole, let's talk about the Stephen W. Taylor remix versus the Ben Wiseman Stereo Master, which were, of course, featured in the Charisma Years box set, as well as a standalone issue of Pawn Hearts. Ben Wiseman's Stereo Master is warm and pleasant. Fans of vintage sound will be pleased, I think. And it's not in any way compressed as far as I can tell. It sounds really, really good, and it's miles ahead of the 2005 master that I grew up on. That said, the original mix sounds dull to me in comparison to Stephen W. Taylor's remix. The Stephen W. Taylor mixes sound much punchier, livelier, but they don't lose the essential character. I also find the drums slightly more powerful on the original mix at times, the kick drum especially, but the overall drum fidelity is much improved across the whole album, but especially on side 2 of Taylor's mix compared to the original. In the Taylor mix, there's a little extra vocal harmonies on Lemmings. Pay attention to the line, "No life lies in the quicksand," which was cool to hear. I also love how Stephen W. Taylor makes little moments shine on this album by making them much more immersive, such as the scattered ending of Lemmings. On Man-Erg, it seems that Stephen W. Taylor may have actually tuned the piano a little bit. On the original mix, it kind of comes across as like that flat-sounding saloon piano. I also noticed that Hamill's voice is panned completely hard right on the intro of the original mix, and by the last verse, I think he's panned all the way left. In the Stephen W. Taylor mix, he centered Hamill's voice for the entire track. Also, pay attention to Jackson's sax in the middle section. They are much louder to the point of being jarring in the original mix, which is something I do kind of like, but I also enjoy how Stephen W. Taylor has positioned the saxes in the 5.1 space as they whip around your head. Peter Hamill's vocals have almost too much dynamic range to me on the original mix, and I applaud Stephen W. Taylor for making them more even. Hamill's voice could not have been easy to record back in those days, or really these days either. He goes from delicate whisper quiet to psychotic screaming, sometimes in the same line. The ending part of Man-Erg, where they layer the bridge section over the outro, knocks me out every single time, and it has never been more transparent than it is in Taylor's versions. It's clear to me that Stephen W. Taylor improved the sound of the drums on this album considerably. They sound quite bad on A Plague of Lighthouse Keepers on the original mix. They have a good sounding kick drum, but the tom-toms sound like bread on the original. The key word to appreciating Taylor's mixes is balance. The original mix of A Plague of Lighthouse Keepers especially has lots of problems with instruments and vocals suddenly jumping out at you, and Taylor's mixes do a great job of fixing this, and making the suite in particular sound much more musical. You can kind of tell it was all pieced together, but the new mixes just have better flow, and I think he may have adjusted some of the edits in a few places. Crucially, We Go Now, the ending of A Plague of Lighthouse Keepers, Taylor edited back in some of Guy's drums, and I think his jazzy groove helps make this section for me. It always fell a bit flat on the original mix, and now I know why. This ending feels much more satisfying to me, and Taylor's mixes do wonders to make this crazy album cinematic, inviting, and intoxicating. The mere fact that a 5.1 of this crazy great album exists is a miracle, but the fact that it's this good makes it one of my favorite and most valued examples of the format I've heard to date. So, those are my thoughts. What do you think of Pawn Hearts? Do you love the new Stephen W. Taylor mixes? What's your double LP track listing look like? Also, if you're watching this video, maybe try my track listing and give me some feedback. Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. In the meantime, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to encourage me to create more content just like this. Next, I'll be discussing Gentle Giant's Playing the Fool, which is coming in a newly constructed Atmos mix, as well as Pink Floyd's Live in Pompeii. Catch you soon.